Friends, comrades, and fellow Americans, history teaches us that every empire eventually discovers the limits of its own power. Yet the tragedy of decline rarely begins with defeat on the battlefield. It begins when control becomes more expensive than cooperation. What we are witnessing today in the US China trade conflict is not simply an argument about tariffs, deficits, or industrial policy. It is the visible symptom of a deeper structural transformation, the evolution of global capitalism into a system that no longer trades in goods but in obedience. In this new order, Washington's tools are not armies but regulations, sanctions, and blacklists. The so called entity list, once a targeted mechanism for national security, has become a global instrument of coercion. By threatening to add foreign companies to this list, the United States can paralyze entire sectors of another nation's economy. The logic is simple and brutal: comply with our strategic objectives or watch your markets collapse. When the Netherlands was compelled to seize Nexperia, a semiconductor firm owned by Chinese investors, it was not exercising sovereignty, it was surrendering it. A European democracy invoked a Cold War law to confiscate private property, not because its own citizens demanded it, but because Washington insisted upon it. This is what I call the economics of coercion. It replaces mutual benefit with conditional loyalty, transforming alliances into dependencies. For smaller states, the cost of disobedience is economic isolation. For the United States, the cost of enforcement is moral decay. The more it forces others to comply, the less legitimate its leadership becomes. History reminds us that imperial control is always self defeating. The British Empire taxed its colonies until rebellion became cheaper than obedience. The Soviet Union subsidized satellite states until its own economy collapsed under the weight. Today, the American empire is discovering the same paradox. It can dominate the world economy, but only by destroying the trust that made that dominance possible. Empires rarely collapse because they are defeated. They collapse because they cannot afford their own control. When we speak of war today, we no longer speak of tanks or trenches. The modern battlefield is digital, bureaucratic, and sanitized. Its soldiers wear suits, not uniforms. Its weapons are spreadsheets and legal codes. The new imperial arsenal is economic composed not of bullets, but of bans, sanctions, and blacklists. This is how late stage capitalism wages war, by controlling the flow of credit, information, and technology rather than territory. The entity list, administered by the US Department of Commerce, exemplifies this quiet militarization of the global economy. Once a narrow national security tool, it has expanded into a global mechanism of domination. By placing a company's name on a single spreadsheet in Washington, the US can effectively cut it off from the entire Western financial and technological system. No missiles are launched, no borders crossed, yet the destruction can be total. Chinese firms like Huawei or SMIC are well known victims, but the collateral damage extends far beyond Beijing. European and Asian companies find themselves trapped in a web of compliance rules, fearing that one wrong transaction could trigger economic annihilation. This phenomenon is not without precedent. In the 20th century, oil embargoes were used to strangle nations that defied Western interests from Japan before World War II to Iran during the Cold War. But where oil embargoes required fleets and blockades, today's sanctions require only algorithms and consent. The empire's new genius lies in invisibility. It can cripple without appearing to kill, dictate without appearing to rule. Yet there is a profound danger in this transformation. When the marketplace becomes a battlefield, every participant becomes a potential combatant. Allies turn into instruments, competitors into targets, and the trust that underpins capitalism corrodes from within. The invisible war, once justified by security, now threatens to consume the very system it claims to defend. When trade becomes a weapon, every ally becomes a potential hostage. If you want to understand how economic imperialism works in the 21st century, you need look no further than the quiet expropriation of Nexperia. It is a case that exposes how the rhetoric of national security conceals a deeper truth that sovereignty itself has become conditional, least to the highest power in the hierarchy of dependence. Nexperia was, on paper, a Dutch semiconductor company, European, regulated, and productive. Yet its ownership by China's Wingtech made it an inconvenient success story. It proved that Chinese capital could revive a struggling Western firm and integrate it profitably into the global market. That success defied the Western narrative that Chinese ownership equals theft, parasitism, or decline. And so Washington intervened. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials delivered an ultimatum to The Hague: remove the Chinese CEO or watch the company added to the American entity list, a financial death sentence. The Dutch government, caught between economic logic and imperial pressure, chose obedience. Invoking a Cold War relic, the Goods Availability Act of 1952, the Netherlands effectively nationalized the firm overnight. The Chinese CEO was dismissed, the board dismantled, and all shares frozen under state trusteeship. Publicly, officials spoke of protecting European technology. Privately, they feared Washington's wrath. It was a textbook demonstration of coercive diplomacy, an act of compliance masquerading as independence. This episode marks a critical moment in the evolution of global capitalism. The free market, once advertised as the triumph of voluntary exchange, now operates through compulsion. Nations are forced to sacrifice their own industries on the altar of alliance politics. In the name of security, they destroy the very stability they claim to protect. The Nexperia affair is not about chips. It is about the illusion of choice in an interdependent empire. For the Netherlands, sovereignty ended not with invasion, but with a phone call. Security becomes a mask when fear is profitable. Empires do not endure through power alone, they endure through fear. And in our era, fear has become the most sophisticated currency of international politics. The United States, facing the erosion of its post-war dominance, has learned to convert anxiety into alignment. It no longer asks its allies for consent, it manufactures it. By framing China not merely as a competitor, but as a civilizational threat, Washington transforms economic rivalry into a moral crusade. Treasury officials now speak as though Beijing were pointing a bazooka at the supply chains of the free world. This language is not policy, it is theater. It paints the world in absolutes. democracy versus despotism, virtue versus danger. In this script, any nation seeking balanced relations with China appears naive, and any call for independence sounds like betrayal. The result is strategic obedience disguised as shared values. This fear narrative performs two crucial functions. First, it justifies coercion, allowing Washington to pressure allies, seize companies, or impose sanctions while claiming moral necessity. Second, it provides psychological cover for decline. When an empire's material power wanes, myth becomes its strongest weapon. By dramatizing external threats, it distracts from internal contradictions, debt, inequality, and a hollowed out middle class. The enemy abroad conceals the crisis at home, but fear, like credit, demands ever increasing returns. Each act of compliance must be followed by a larger one, each sanctioned by a harsher decree. Allies are drawn into a cycle of dependence in which disobedience feels fatal. The Netherlands, Japan, South Korea all find themselves trapped in this theater, applauding lines written in Washington. And so a paradox emerges. The more the empire preaches freedom, the more it governs through fear. The louder it warns of tyranny abroad, the more it demands submission from its friends. A frightened ally is the most reliable weapon. Every empire eventually reaches the moment when its ideology turns against its own material foundation. For the United States, that moment is now. The contradiction tearing through Washington is not between Democrats and Republicans or between hawks and doves. It is between capitalism and capital itself. The system that glorifies free markets now wages war on the very global networks that sustain its profits. Nowhere is this contradiction more visible than in the Trump era's economic theater. The president, ever the showman, learned to treat markets as mirrors of his popularity. When the Dow rose, he declared victory. When it fell, he panicked. Yet the same man who boasted of American business vitality also threatened to cripple global supply chains with 100% tariffs, sanctions, and export bans. Traders soon learned his rhythm. They called it the Tao pattern. Trump always chickens out. Each week began with a threat that sent markets crashing and ended with a conciliatory tweet to calm investors. The emperor of capital could roar against globalization only until his own portfolio trembled. This schizophrenia is not a quirk of personality, it is a reflection of systemic decay. Late stage capitalism cannot choose between the illusion of national independence and the reality of global interdependence. Wall Street's fortunes are tied to the very Chinese manufacturing base Washington condemns. Every sanction that punishes Beijing sends shockwaves through American pension funds, tech firms, and consumers. The empire demands confrontation, but its capital demands continuity. And so the United States oscillates between aggression and retreat, threatening, then reassuring, attacking, then investing. It is the behavior of a system at war with itself, unable to reconcile ideology with arithmetic. The tragedy is not that the empire has enemies, but that its greatest adversary is the logic of its own economy. You cannot wage war on your supplier without wounding your shareholder. When Marx wrote that capital has no homeland, he described a world in which money and production transcend borders, loyal only to profit. But what happens when that borderless capital begins to threaten the political authority of the nations that host it. The Nexperia case answers this question with painful clarity. Globalization may have dissolved the boundaries of markets, but not the instincts of power. Inside Nexperia, before the Dutch government ever intervened, an internal coup was already underway. Three senior Western executives, European nationals, filed an extraordinary petition accusing their Chinese CEO of mismanagement. Instead of appealing to the board, they went directly to Dutch courts and politicians, bypassing every corporate protocol. The timing was not coincidental. Washington's pressure campaign against Chinese firms was peaking, and the Dutch government stood weakened by a collapsed coalition. In this vacuum, the executive's actions aligned perfectly with geopolitical convenience. Corporate rivalry became state action. This was not merely a business dispute, it was class struggle within capital itself. On one side stood transnational capital Chinese ownership, seeking efficiency and integration in global supply chains. On the other stood national capital Western executives defending their privileged access to state power and domestic legitimacy. The coup succeeded because it fused economic ambition with political ideology. The state, eager to prove loyalty to its imperial patron, provided the muscle that private actors alone could not muster. The incident reveals how globalization's myth of neutrality collapses under pressure. When profit flows freely, capitalists celebrate interdependence. When power feels threatened, they rediscover nationalism. It is a choreography as old as empire. The moment capital fears losing control, it wraps itself in the flag. Nexperia's tragedy, then, is not an exception but a mirror. It reflects how the supposed unity of global capitalism fractures into competing sovereignties whenever the hierarchy of ownership is challenged. Capital has no homeland until it feels threatened. History is merciless to those who believe control guarantees stability. Time and again, empires tighten their grip only to watch the world slip through their fingers. The seizure of Nexperia, meant to secure Europe's supply chain, has instead become a living parable of this truth. When coercion becomes policy, chaos becomes consequence. The Dutch government, under U.S. pressure, believed nationalizing Nexperia would protect strategic assets. In reality, it ignited a geopolitical wildfire. Within days of the takeover, Beijing retaliated, decisively banning the export of all Nexperia chips produced in China. Given that roughly 80% of the company's manufacturing and 70% of its final assembly occur within Chinese territory, the Netherlands had seized a hollow shell. The production heart remained firmly in Asia, beyond the reach of Western law. The result was paralysis. Nexperia's European branches and its Chinese divisions descended into bureaucratic civil war, two managements issuing contradictory orders, both claiming legitimacy. Employees didn't know whose salaries would be paid, whose contracts were valid, or which government they were meant to obey. The national security operation intended to prevent disruption had single-handedly created one. Soon, the ripple effects spread outward. The global automotive sector, from Toyota to BMW, warned of impending shortages in essential chips. Supply lines that had survived the pandemic now buckled under political intervention. And in the ultimate irony, the law used to justify the Seizure of the Goods Availability Act of 1952 was designed to prevent exactly this kind of breakdown. In the name of protecting access to goods, the Netherlands had made those goods unavailable. This is capitalism's cruel dialectic. Every mechanism of control births the conditions of its undoing. When fear dictates policy, efficiency collapses. When allies act under duress, cooperation turns to suspicion. What begins as order ends as entropy. Every empire builds its own crisis. The only question is when it detonates. In the 20th century, empires rose and fell over oil, the liquid that powered industries, wars, and modernity itself. But in the 21st century, the new oil is the microchip, a substance not extracted from the ground, but from human intelligence, etched in layers of silicon and code. Whoever controls the design, production, and distribution of semiconductors controls the nervous system of the global economy. The United States understands this, which is why the so called chip war is not merely about trade, it is about empire. By targeting firms like Huawei, ASML, and Nexperia, Washington aims to dominate the supply of what it now considers a strategic resource. Its small yard, high fence doctrine, allowing only a handful of nations access to cutting edge chip technology, is presented as a defense of democracy. In truth, it is a defense of hierarchy, a system where technological privilege replaces colonial territory as the foundation of control. But the flaw in this strategy is structural. Unlike oil, which could be monopolized by geography, chips depend on global collaboration. The design may be American, the lithography Dutch, the materials Japanese, the assembly Chinese, and the buyers everywhere. The global supply chain is a single organism. Harm one artery, and the entire body convulses. When Washington forces allies to block exports or seize companies, it is not building fences around its enemies, it is cutting the very veins of its own economy. ASML's machines banned from China now sit idle in European warehouses. Nexperia's factories seized in Europe are paralyzed in Asia. The empire's attempt to command the future has fractured the present. In the pursuit of control, it undermines the very system of interdependence that once secured its wealth. The new resource war is not fought over oil fields, but over ideas, and ideas do not obey borders. To monopolize them is to misunderstand their nature. In trying to fence the future, America may be fencing itself in. Globalization once promised a single integrated world, one marketplace, one internet, one financial system. But the promise has collapsed under its own contradictions. By weaponizing interdependence, the United States has transformed the global economy into a battlefield of separation. What began as an effort to contain China's rise is now producing something far more consequential: the birth of two technological civilizations. We are witnessing a historic fracture. On one side, the American led sphere anchored by the dollar, Wall Street, and Western supply chains. On the other, a Chinese centered ecosystem building its own semiconductor industry, payment networks, and digital infrastructure. Each side is erecting parallel systems to insulate itself from the other's leverage. The very tools of coercion Washington used, sanctions, export bans, and blacklists, have become blueprints for Beijing's independence. By forcing its rival to decouple, America is accelerating the fragmentation it most fears. Consider the chip industry. ASML's blocked lithography machines have spurred massive Chinese investment into domestic alternatives. Or the race over rare earth minerals, where Washington's new alliance with India and the EU mirrors Beijing's resource strategy from a decade ago. The world is no longer a web of interdependence, it is a pair of competing nervous systems, each constructing its own version of reality, finance, and trust. But the danger goes beyond economics. As these two spheres harden, truth itself begins to bifurcate. Information, technology, and ideology become region locked. Globalization once made the world interlinked. Now it is making it incompatible. The flow of data, chips, and capital, the very lifeblood of modern civilization, is being filtered through geopolitical fear. History tells us this path ends not in security, but in stagnation. When Rome built walls to keep out the barbarians, it soon discovered it had walled itself in. The empire's borders became its cage. Every wall built to keep rivals out eventually keeps the builders in. When historians look back on this era, they will not remember it as the age of tariffs or sanctions, but as the moment when the logic of empire finally devoured itself. What we call a trade war is not merely a clash of nations, it is the symptom of a system exhausting its own foundations. Late stage capitalism, like late Rome, carries within it the seeds of its undoing: overreach, moral fatigue, and the illusion of control. The Roman Empire extended its legions to every frontier until the cost of maintenance exceeded the wealth of conquest. Today, the United States extends its sanctions, bases, and financial dictates across every market, believing it can still command obedience by decree. But every act of coercion deepens the world's desire for autonomy. The same system that once united production and consumption under the banner of globalization now fractures into rival blocks, each building walls to defend itself from the instability born in Washington's halls of power. This is the paradox of hegemony. The more it asserts itself, the weaker it becomes. The empire must constantly invent enemies to justify its dominance, and in doing so, it feeds the very resistance that erodes its authority. What was once leadership has become compulsion. What was once consent has become fear. The cycle is unsustainable, for no economy can thrive when its survival depends on the submission of others. We are left with the image of an empire shouting across the marketplace it no longer controls, demanding loyalty from allies who quietly hedge their bets. And as the noise of rhetoric grows, another sound emerges: the silence of disbelief, the silence of nations once compliant, now calculating their own paths forward. The end of empire never announces itself with defeat, but with silence, when even its allies stop believing in its story.